We're ready to send our scene over to Unreal Studio and begin the work toward creating our real-time walkthrough. You have a few different options to export here. The two we'll cover are FBX and DataSmith. The differences between the two are pretty stark, but they both ultimately get your asset into Unreal. The real difference is that DataSmith can export your entire scene in one go with just a few clicks. We can send the entire scene to Unreal, including all materials, lights, cameras, and geometry, and even IES profiles. Before we start exporting, however, we need a project to work with, so let's hop into Unreal Studio and set a project up. In the Unreal Launcher, I'll go to my library, and we're going to, rather than choose one of my pre-built projects here, I'm just going to launch the editor. In the Unreal Project browser, go to New Project, and from here, there's a couple of routes we can take. So first of all, if we click on the Unreal Studio tab, we can create a new blank project. Now, if we do this, our project is automatically set up for Unreal Studio. However, it's not going to have any first-person controls or anything like that, allowing the viewer to be able to move around the level. We'd have to build all those from scratch, and you can certainly do that using blueprints. But in order to save some time, I'm just going to go to the Blueprint tab here and choose the first-person project type. Now, by doing this, we're not going to have the benefit of starting in an Unreal Studio project, but I'll show you how to easily convert your first-person project into one. Okay, so now that our project is set up, we have a default level here with a player in the middle of it, and if we play that, we can see that he can fire a gun, and we can walk around and jump, and of course, we're not going to need any of this in our architectural walkthrough for our viewers. So we'll look into how to get rid of this stuff when we get into the interactivity section. But for now, we know that we have a working system that we can actually walk around in. Now, in order to bring in our DataSmith file, we'll need to create a blank level. So we'll go to File and then just choose New Level, and we'll go with an empty level here. So we'll go to Settings, and then under here, we'll choose Plugins. Just scroll down until you find Unreal Studio. And on the bottom here, we want to hit this button that says Convert, Project, and Restart. So now that the project is converted, if we go back down to Unreal Studio, we can see that all of the plugins are enabled for importing our assets. Now we're first going to look at DataSmith export. To export the entire scene, we'll just go to our File Export option in the menu. Browse to the location where you want to export, and then under Save as Type, we want to make sure we have Unreal DataSmith selected. I'm just going to overwrite my previous export here, Loft Style Living Room. You can see here in the DataSmith export options, there's really nothing here. We can just decide what we want to export, whether it's the entire scene or visible objects, or our current selection. So we'll leave it as visible objects. And now using the Import DataSmith button at the top here, we can import our assets. So we'll browse to the folder that contains our export, our DataSmith export, and just double click it. And in the import window for DataSmith, we just need to specify what folder we want it to go into. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder under Content, and we'll call it DataSmith Import. In the second window that pops up, this is the DataSmith Import Options window. It's really just a few options here we need to make sure are checked. Obviously, we want to include geometry, materials and textures and lights, and if you were bringing in any cameras, you would check that as well, but in this case, we aren't. We want to open, though, the Show Advanced option here, because under Static Mesh Options, we have the ability to adjust the minimum and maximum light map resolutions. Now, DataSmith and Unreal Studio are going to automatically generate light maps for us, and we'll talk more about light maps when we get into the lighting section of the course. Now, the settings that I recommend here are to set minimum and maximum to the same value of 512. And what this is going to do is it's going to tell DataSmith to maximize the UV coordinate space for your light map UVs. So with the maximum light map size set at 512 by 512, the generator will do its best to take up the entire resolution of the light map with UVs when it flattens out the mesh. Once it finishes importing the scene, you're going to find all of the assets for the scene in your content browser. So if we recall, I chose the DataSmith import folder, and in there you'll find the name of the DataSmith file. So this is Loft Style Living Room. And in there we've got our geometries folder, which contains all of the meshes, the materials folder containing obviously the materials, and the textures folder, which obviously contains the textures. And then we have some IES profiles that were brought in, as well as the actual DataSmith import file. If we ever want to re-import DataSmith, we can right-click and choose Re-import, and that will bring in all of those assets again. If we've made changes and re-exported, we can do that there. Now, when you first bring it in, you're going to see this compiling shaders window at the bottom. Just be patient, let it finish. That's why right now everything looks like a checkerboard pattern. It's still working on creating all of those physically based shaders for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at FBX export options. Now in FBX export options, we can uncheck tangents and binormals. We can uncheck turbo smooth. We can uncheck convert deforming dummies to bones, uncheck triangulate. We don't need any of these. All we really need is preserve edge orientation and smoothing groups. Under animation, we don't generally need this unless we have an object that obviously has some sort of animation built into it, but we're going to go ahead and uncheck that for now. Under cameras, if we're going to export our cameras, we'll need to make sure that this is checked. In this case, we aren't. Obviously under lights, the same thing. We're not exporting any lights in this case, so we'll uncheck that. Now we don't need embed media because as long as this object is using a standard material type, when we export it into Unreal, Unreal will automatically locate the textures for that material and bring them in. Bear in mind, however, that with FBX export, we cannot export V-Ray materials. That will only work when we use DataSmith. Below this, under the advanced options, we have the ability to change the scale factor of our scene for the units. Now right now it's set to automatic. And in my case, because this scene is using centimeters, we don't have to mess with this. But if you wanted to, you could come in here, disable automatic, and change the scene units converted drop down. So if you were using feet and inches in your scene, you could set this to centimeters. And then when this exports, it would do its best to convert the scene into centimeters. Generally, I do not recommend using this option, so leave this to automatic. It doesn't work very well. The best solution is to go into your 3D tool and convert all of your assets to the proper scale that way. After that, we have axis conversion, and we want to make sure that the axis is set for a Z up axis. That's what Unreal uses. So just make sure this dropdown says Z up. Now we can see here with FBX, we've got some warnings of our material types. I'm exporting an entire group of objects here, so we can see we've got these books and magazines and whatnot. These are using material types that are not supported by FBX. That's because these are V-Ray materials. So when we bring this over into Unreal, the materials will exist. They will have materials, but they won't be able to bring in the textures. Now in Unreal, we just need to hit the Import button, and we'll select our coffee table. So here we have some more options we need to examine. In the FBX import options, we have, first of all, the mesh dropdown, and we want to make sure that skeletal mesh is not checked. A skeletal mesh is going to be more like a character, something that's animated using a skeleton. In this case, we're bringing in a coffee table and some books and whatnot, and none of them have animation on them. So we want them to come in as static meshes. So we want to uncheck skeletal mesh. We can also automatically generate collision, and we'll talk more about that later on in the course. We'll go ahead and leave this checked for now and use this advanced button here to get a little more detail, some more options here on our mesh import. Now, a lot of these options here we're going to skip over because they're not important to an architectural interior, such as this LOD group dropdown. We don't really get a benefit from using LODs in a small confined space, so we won't be talking about that. However, if we look down a little lower, we've got this Generate Lightmap UVs option. We want to make sure that that is checked for us, and that's going to automatically create Lightmap UVs. We'll talk about Lightmap UVs coming up soon, but basically this is going to allow us to get our baked lighting. Below this, we have Transform Vertex to Absolute. Now, with this checked, anything we import is basically going to have its pivot point, its origin, at the origin of the world, at 0, 0, 0. If you don't want that, if you want your assets to use their own pivot points, their own origins, make sure you uncheck Transform Vertex to Absolute. The Convert Scene checkbox, which is enabled by default, will allow us to determine if we want to convert the FBX coordinates to the Unreal Engine coordinate system, which is a left-handed system, and 3ds Max is a right-handed system, so we'll go ahead and make sure that this is checked. We can also choose Force Front X Axis. Now this is going to make sure that the front of all your assets has the X axis pointing towards the front. Then we have Convert Scene Unit. The Convert Scene Unit checkbox will allow you to convert whatever units you're using in the FBX file into the centimeter-based system of Unreal Engine 4. I don't recommend using this option. It's not going to work very well. It's still better just to go into your 3D tool and set up the system to centimeters to begin with. Build your stuff in that centimeter-based system, or at least convert it using the tools available to you in the 3D tool. Under Materials, we just want to make sure that Import Materials and Textures are checked. But remember, if your materials are V-Ray-based materials or non-standard materials, any material that FBX export does not support, then when you bring them in, the materials are going to be missing the textures. Unreal will not be able to find the textures for them. But if they are standard materials, that won't be a problem. Now that we've got all our data into Unreal Studio, it's time to begin lighting it up. We'll cover lighting in detail throughout the next sections.